In January of 1723, I opened a grave in the village of Medvedja, and the dead man inside smelled of warm bread and copper pennies, and freshly turned garden earth, as though he had been sleeping rather than rotting in frozen ground for 6 weeks. His cheeks held color. When I pressed 2 fingers against the flesh of his forearm, the tissue yielded and returned, the way living tissue yields and returns, not the rigid wax resistance of a corpse in winter cold. I have performed more than 400 examinations of the dead across 17 years of surgical practice in service to the Habsburg crown. I know what a man buried in January should smell like. I know what he should not. My name is Johann Ernst Flückinger. I held the rank of Regimentsfeldherr, regimental field surgeon, assigned to the imperial garrison at Parakin, and in the second week of January 1723, I was ordered by written commission to travel to the village of Medvedja, some distance northeast of that garrison, to conduct a formal inquiry into what the garrison commander had described in his forwarded report as disturbing claims of posthumous activity among the village dead. The commander's letter was careful in the way that men are careful when they believe something and cannot afford to. He wrote that villagers had presented themselves at the garrison in a state of organized rather than hysterical alarm, and that their claims, though medically untenable, had been repeated with consistency across 11 separate individuals who showed no signs of collusion or shared delusion. He asked for a surgeon and an official imperial commission, and he received me. I will state for this board what I stated in my original field notes, before those notes were revised by imperial office. I arrived in Medvedja, intending to document one of 3 things: premature burial, which the conditions of winter would have favored, slowing decomposition and mimicking death in the weakened and fevered; contamination of the village water supply, which could account for neurological symptoms including visual and auditory disturbance across a community sharing a single well; or collective grief psychosis of the kind I had read of in Waldenstrom's notes on plague communities, where the unbearable nature of mass loss produces shared hallucination as a form of social comfort. I had a framework. I believed in it. I want this board to understand that my subsequent difficulty was not a failure of rationality. It was an excess of it. I observed too carefully to maintain my original conclusions. And that, gentlemen, is what this deposition is about. I will come to the exhumations in proper sequence. But I want to plant a marker here, in the early part of this account, so that this board understands what was waiting at the end of my investigation. There were 14 names on my commission paper, 14 confirmed dead whose neighbors swore they had spoken with them after burial. I will account for each of those names before I am finished. And there was a smell, encountered first at the churchyard wall, then at the village well, then at the threshold of my own quarters, that I recorded 3 separate times in my field notes, as unlike anything produced by decomposition I have encountered in 17 years of surgical practice. I will account for that smell as well. I mention it now because by the time I describe its 3rd occurrence, this board will understand why I am no longer able to dismiss it as contamination, and I want you to have been warned. I arrived in Medvedja on the 12th of January. The journey took 4 days from Parakin in a post wagon that was not designed for the mountain roads, and by the time the driver pointed through the fogged glass at the cluster of steep-roofed houses descending toward a frozen creek, below a ridge of dark spruce, I had reorganized my medical case twice for something to do with my hands, and composed 3 opening paragraphs of the report I expected to write. The village was small, perhaps 60 families, mostly Serbian-speaking, with a Hungarian-speaking community of perhaps 15 households occupying the eastern end of the valley. There was a garrison outpost of 22 infantry, commanded by a young officer named Hauptmann Schreiber, who met my wagon in the village square, and looked, I noted clinically, like a man who had not slept well in some time. Schreiber was 26 or 27, lean and precise in his speech, a man trained to manage what he understood and to contain what he did not. He told me, in the flat voice of someone who has rehearsed a set of facts specifically to drain them of implication, that the first incident had occurred in early December, 6 weeks prior, when a woman named Stana, buried 2 days after dying of a difficult birth, was reportedly seen by her husband crossing the yard between their house and their neighbor's house at 3 in the morning. The husband had described her gait as purposeful. He had called to her by name. She had not responded and had continued past the neighbor's fence, and by the time he had dressed and gone out into the cold, she was not visible in any direction. 3 days later, one of the neighbor's older children fell into a fever from which it did not recover. I asked Schreiber, as we walked toward the garrison outpost, what his own assessment was. He stopped walking. He looked at me sideways and then ahead. Then he said something I have not forgotten. He said, "My assessment is that I wrote to Parakin for a surgeon because I have 22 men who are beginning to refuse the night watch near the churchyard, and a surgeon can provide an official medical explanation for what they are seeing. I would like you to provide one." I told him I intended to. He said, "Good." Then he told me that 3 more people had reported similar encounters in the weeks following the Stana incident, and that those 3 had then sickened, 2 fatally, and that those 2 were now also in the churchyard, and that their families had, in the past week, begun reporting similar things. It was, structurally, a classic fear propagation cycle. 1 genuine death from complications following childbirth, a secondary death or 2 from unrelated winter illness, a community of grieving people with a pre-existing folkloric framework for interpreting loss, and fear compounding fear until the entire village was dreaming corpses at their windows. I was almost completely certain of this, but I noted, walking through the village square toward the garrison gate, that the air smelled of cold and pine smoke, and something else, very faint, something sweetish and mineral at the same time, like copper filings held near a warm oven. I did not note it in my field records at that moment. I wish I had. It would have established a timeline. The garrison outpost occupied a stone building at the northern end of the village, a former mill with its wheel removed, 2 ground-floor rooms converted to sleeping quarters, and 1 to an office and storeroom. Schreiber had arranged a bunk in the office for me, which I took as a small sign that he wanted me proximate to him and his chain of command, not quartered with the civilians. That judgment turned out to be correct, for reasons neither of us anticipated at the time. The first person I formally interviewed on the 13th of January was the village priest, Father Dusan, a man in his late 50s with a broad face, careful hands, and the manner of someone who has been disbelieved before and has stopped being wounded by it. He spoke Serbian, and my translator was a garrison corporal named Metzger, who had grown up near the border and spoke the language well enough for practical purposes, though he told me privately he sometimes missed the connotations. Father Dusan's account was this. In the month of December, he had conducted 4 funerals. 3 of those 4 deceased had subsequently been reported by multiple separate witnesses as seen walking in the village. He had not seen any of them himself, but he had smelled something, twice, at the gate of the churchyard, something he described to Metzger as the wrong kind of sweet, the sweetness that has teeth in it. He had sprinkled the gate with holy water both times. He did not think it had helped. I asked him whether he considered it possible that the sightings were the product of grief-induced misidentification, living villagers mistaken in poor light for those who had died. He considered the question with visible respect for it. Then he told me through Metzger that there were 3 specific sightings in which the deceased had been seen in locations where no living person had been determined to have gone, and in one case, the deceased had been recognized by a neighbor who had herself assisted in washing and laying out the body, a woman who had spent hours in direct contact with the corpse and knew its face as well as her own hand. I noted this. I did not assign it weight yet. I asked Father Dusan when he expected me to conduct the first exhumation, and he said the village council had agreed that it should be as soon as possible, the following morning if I was prepared. I told him I was prepared. The second person I interviewed that first day was the eldest woman of the village, a widow named Marta Vukovic, who had lived in Medvedja for longer than anyone could verify, and who was brought to me in the garrison office by 2 of her grandsons, each of whom held one of her arms not to support her. She walked well enough, but because they seemed to need the contact. She was perhaps 70. Her eyes were clear and flat, the way eyes become when a person has outlived most of their assumptions. Metzger translated for her, but she watched my face rather than his when she spoke, which told me she was experienced in the gap between what is said and what is meant. She said the dead who were returning were not confused. This was the point she made first and returned to. They were not wandering without purpose, the way the grief psychosis model would predict. They were going to specific houses, to specific people, for specific reasons. She named 3 of them. A man called Pejasevich, who had died in November owing a debt to his brother, and who had appeared at the brother's window twice before the brother fell ill. A young woman called Ruza, dead of the fever in December, who had been seen standing at the door of the man she had been promised to before the match was broken off. And an old farmer, name of Dragic, who had died in October and whose dog had refused to leave the spot near the barn where it last saw him, even in the worst cold, and who a farmhand had seen 3 weeks after burial, walking along the field fence at dusk, moving his hands along the top rail, as though counting the boards. I noted all of this. I asked her, what did they want, these returning dead? She looked at me for a moment before answering, and what she said, through Metzger, was this: they want what was not finished. The Jew wants his coin back. The mother wants to nurse the child. The man who died angry is still angry. They are not done, and being put in the ground did not end them. I asked her what she recommended, practically, for the situation. She said the dead needed to be found in their graves and dealt with properly, which meant I needed to open the graves, and if what I found was what she expected me to find, I would know what to do from there. I told her I would let the medical evidence guide me. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite dismissal, and her grandsons helped her stand, and they left. That night I sat in the garrison office with my commission paper and wrote the first 14 names. The list had been compiled from interviews conducted by Schreiber's men in the weeks prior to my arrival. 14 confirmed dead, buried in the churchyard, whose neighbors had reported seeing or speaking with them after burial. Not rumor, not second-hand account, but direct reported contact, in most cases from multiple witnesses who had known the dead person in life and could not be easily deceived by a stranger in poor light. 14 names. I wrote them in a careful column on a sheet of Imperial Commission paper, in the same hand I use for surgical records, because I believed then that this was a surgical matter that would be resolved by surgical evidence. I did not know then, writing that list, that it would be the last document I produced under the authority of the Habsburg Imperial Commission. I folded the paper and placed it in my medical case. The case was leather, battered at the clasps, and I had carried it since my posting to the Balkans. I want the board to understand where that paper has been and where it is now, because its present condition is part of this deposition. On the morning of the 14th of January, in frost so sharp it burned the inside of the nose, I conducted the first exhumation. Schreiber assigned me 4 soldiers to do the digging, and Father Dusan attended, and several members of the village council stood at the churchyard wall and watched without coming closer. The first grave we opened was that of a man called Miloj Zivkovic, dead of a chest ailment, buried 11 weeks prior. Standard winter burial, the ground frozen at the surface and unfrozen below. I need to describe what we found without ornamentation, because this board has asked for my sensory record, and I intend to give it precisely. The first indication was the smell, not from the open air, not from the churchyard in general, from the grave itself, as the soldiers broke the last foot of soil and the coffin lid became visible. It rose from the opened earth in a column, warm against the frozen air, and it was not the smell of 11 weeks of winter decomposition. It was the smell I had caught faintly on my first evening in the village, the copper-sweet earth combination, but fuller now, close, almost physical in its density. I stepped back and took 2 breaths of cold air before stepping forward again. I noted it immediately in my field journal, writing the time, the temperature as I estimated it, and the description, a sweetish, mineral odor, like copper instrument casings warmed by a hand. Not the sulfur-ammonia spectrum of decomposition, not the methane softness of deep putrefaction. Something else. We opened the coffin. Miloje Zivkovic lay on his back in the attitude of burial, arms crossed, in the linen shroud Father Dusan had prepared. His face was not the face of 11 weeks dead. His cheeks held a flush of color, not the livid purple-red of blood pooled by gravity, but a distributed warmth, like the color remaining in a face an hour after death, not 11 weeks. His lips were not fully closed. I used a probe to open them further and examined the interior of the mouth. The tongue was soft and pink. There was no blackening, no bloat, no retraction of the gums that produces the false appearance of grown hair in decomposed bodies. His teeth were clean. His hair, which I examined carefully, had not shifted on the scalp as it does in bodies that have passed through the stages of putrefaction. I pressed 2 fingers, as I described at the opening of this account, against the flesh of his forearm. It yielded and returned. I examined the linen shroud. There was, at the mouth area, a small staining that was not consistent with the expected seepage of decomposition fluids. It was darker, a rust copper color. I took a sample on a strip of clean linen from my kit. I noted its color and consistency. The color was consistent with blood that had dried within the past several days, not weeks. I did not announce this to the watching village council. I asked Father Dusan and the soldiers to close the grave and mark it, and I said I needed to examine more before I could draw conclusions. Father Dusan said, quietly, not through Metzger, in Latin that I could follow well enough, "You see it." Not a question. I did not answer him. We opened 3 more graves that day. I will not describe each in the same detail, but I will give the board the consistent findings across all 4. First, the smell was present in all 4 graves at the moment of opening, strongest in the 2 most recent burials, present but more diffuse in the 2 older ones, those buried 8 and 9 weeks prior, rather than 11. Second, the degree of decomposition in all 4 cases was inconsistent with the time elapsed since burial and the conditions of winter interment. All 4 showed significantly less tissue breakdown than I would have predicted. All 4 showed coloration in the facial tissue, inconsistent with the expected stages. Third, in 2 of the 4 cases, there was staining on the interior linen, consistent with recent bleeding from the mouth. Not old seepage, recent bleeding. Fourth, in 1 case, a woman buried 8 weeks prior, there was something I must describe carefully because it is the detail I most expected to be able to explain away and could not. When we opened her coffin, her shroud had been disturbed. The linen was shifted, gathered toward her right side, as though she had moved within it. The soil above the coffin showed no disturbance from outside. The disturbance was from within. I stood at the edge of that grave for a long time. The soldiers were watching me. Father Dusan was watching me. The village council men at the wall were watching me. I wrote in my field journal, 4 for 4, findings inconsistent with expected decomposition. Possible explanations not yet excluded include soil composition anomaly, unusual cold preservation, premature burial in cases of deep coma. The last 2 I knew, even as I wrote them, did not account for the smell. Cold preservation does not produce that smell. Premature burial does not move the shroud from inside a sealed coffin buried under frozen earth. I returned to the garrison office. I ate the meal Schreiber's cook had prepared, which I recall was some kind of bean stew, and I noted that I had no appetite and ate it anyway from professional habit. Schreiber joined me after the meal and asked what I had found. I told him I had found anomalous preservation conditions and required more time to assess them. He looked at me the way people look at a surgeon who is not telling them the medical truth about a relative, and he accepted it, and he said there was another matter I should know about. He told me then about the corporal. The corporal's name was Franz Brenner. He was 20 years old, from a village in Styria, and had been stationed with the Medvedja garrison for 4 months. 14 days prior, his bunkmate, a man he had served with since his posting, a soldier named Tobias Hauf, had died of a rapid fever, buried in the churchyard according to military protocol. 4 nights ago, Brenner had woken his bunkmates by crying out. When they reached him, he was sitting upright in his cot, staring at the corner of the sleeping room. He said that Tobias had been sitting on the edge of his cot, that he had spoken his name, that the room had smelled wrong, a sweetish smell, and that Tobias had looked at him with an expression that Brenner described as wanting something, but not having found the word for it yet. Brenner had reached toward him, and Tobias had not been there anymore, and the smell had gone, and the room was empty. Brenner had not slept since. He had refused to enter the sleeping room. He was currently spending nights in the office storeroom, in a chair, with a lantern. I asked to speak with Brenner. He was brought to me that evening. He was a compact, ordinarily collected young man who looked, as Schreiber had, like someone operating on insufficient sleep and surplus fear. He gave his account clearly and without embellishment. I noted several things about his presentation that were diagnostically relevant. He was not feverish, not neurologically symptomatic in any way I could observe. His pupils were equal and responsive. His speech was organized and sequential. He repeated the same details in the same order when I asked him to recount the event a second time without prompting. He was not exhibiting hallucination behavior. He was exhibiting witness behavior. What he said about the smell stopped me. He described it unprompted, before I asked. He used the word sweetish. He said it was warm in the cold room. He said it smelled like something metallic, like coins. He had not spoken with Father Dusan. He had not spoken with Marta Vukovic. He had not been present at any of the exhumations. He had arrived at the same description from an entirely independent experience. I documented it. I told Brenner to rest as best he could and to inform me immediately if anything further occurred. Then I told Schreiber I needed to examine Half's grave as soon as possible. Schreiber said the garrison was close to a breaking point. Several of his men had refused the night watch post nearest the churchyard wall, and 2 had requested transfer. He said the unit was splitting, that some of the men believed Brenner and some thought he had been weakened by grief for his friend, and that the rift between the 2 groups was becoming its own command problem. I had not anticipated that human conflict as a distinct complication, and I noted it, because it would become significant later in ways neither Schreiber nor I could fully manage. I slept poorly on the 14th. The office had a window facing the churchyard, and I left the shutters closed, not because I was afraid to look, but because I was not yet ready to test what I would do if I saw something. I lay awake, noting the smells of the room: pine boards, lantern oil, soldiers' boot wax, the faint cold coming off the stone wall. No copper-sweet smell. The night was quiet. I slept eventually. On the 15th, I interviewed 6 more villagers, working through Metzger, building out the accounts behind each of the 14 names on my commission paper. What emerged was a pattern, and I want to lay this pattern before the board clearly, because it is the detail that ultimately made it impossible for me to write the report Vienna expected. The pattern was this. Every person who reported contact with the returned dead had a prior relationship with that specific dead person that contained some form of unresolved element. The brother who owed the debt. The man whose engagement had been broken. The woman who had quarreled with her daughter the week before the daughter's illness. In not one of the 14 cases did the returned dead appear to someone with whom they had had no prior connection. They appeared to their people. They went to the doors of their history. This is not consistent with mass grief psychosis, in which fear is generalized and hallucination latches onto whatever the fearful mind makes available. This is consistent with something purposeful, something that remembered. I am aware of how that sentence reads in a medical deposition. I have had 8 years to consider its implications. I am leaving it in the record. On the afternoon of the 15th, as I was completing my interview notes in the garrison office, the smell came again. I registered it before I had consciously acknowledged it, the way the body sometimes processes the environment ahead of the mind's attention. I was writing, and then I was not writing, and then I was sitting very still with my pen on the paper, smelling it. The copper-sweet warmth of it, there in the cold office, nowhere near the churchyard, in the middle of the afternoon with soldiers moving in the corridor outside. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the cold smell of the room reasserted itself, and it was gone. I went to the doorway and looked into the corridor. 2 soldiers were moving toward the storeroom with a supplies case between them. Neither was Brenner. Neither showed any reaction to anything unusual. I returned to my desk and sat for several minutes before I picked up my pen again. I wrote in my notes, "Smell encountered for second documented instance. Garrison office, approximately 2 in the afternoon, 15th January. Duration brief. No source identified. No other witness present." Then I continued my transcription. "I want this board to note that I did not mention this to Schreiber. I want you to understand why. By the 15th of January, I had been in Medvedja for 3 days, and my framework for this investigation was already under significant strain. I had 14 names on a list, 4 exhumations with anomalous findings, 1 soldier's independent testimony describing the same signature smell, and now a personal encounter with that smell in a location that had no obvious contamination source. If I reported the smell encounter to Schreiber, I would be contributing to the command problem rather than resolving it. I was there to provide a medical explanation. I needed to do so. I told myself I would find one. I examined Tobias Hoff's grave on the morning of the 16th. Hoff had been buried 14 days prior. Winter interment, military protocol, the standard depth. In 14 days of January cold, I would have expected the earliest stages of decomposition, surface tissue beginning to break down, gases forming, the shroud beginning to show the first staining. I would not have expected what I found. The smell from Hoff's grave was the strongest I had encountered. Not rotting, not sulfurous, not the methane bloom of a body proceeding normally through decomposition. The copper-sweet smell, fuller and warmer than any of the previous 4 graves, rising from the opened earth as though it had been contained under pressure and was now released. I stood at the grave edge with Metzger and 2 soldiers, and I watched Metzger take 1 step back involuntarily. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Hoff's face was the face of a man dead a day, possibly 2, not 14. The flesh was soft. The color was present. His expression was one I have not been able to categorize in 17 years of looking at the dead. Not the slack release of death, not the rigor of recent dying, but something that looked, if I am to be entirely honest with this board, like a face between breaths, as though he had been interrupted. I examined the shroud. The interior of the shroud around the mouth and chin showed the rust copper staining I had found in 2 of the previous 4 cases. I took samples. I examined the hands. On the right hand, across 2 of the knuckles, there were what appeared to be fresh abrasions, raw skin, as though the hand had scraped against something recently. Wood. The underside of the coffin lid. I noted this in my field journal, and then I stood up and put my journal in my coat pocket and looked at the sky for a moment, which was white and low and indifferent, and told myself very carefully that there was still an explanation I had not yet found. Metzger said, quietly, not asking me, just saying it, "Herr Doktor." I told him to bring Father Dusan. I had questions about what the appropriate next steps were, according to the village's own practices. Because whatever I was going to write in my official report, I had 22 soldiers stationed in this village, and the garrison was splitting, and I could see that split widening into something dangerous if I did not at least begin to move toward a resolution. Father Dusan was brought. He told me, without drama, what the village council had been requesting since before I arrived. The graves needed to be treated. The bodies that had not passed into proper death needed to be assisted in doing so. He described the method they intended. A stake through the heart cavity, the body burned, the ashes scattered outside the churchyard boundaries. He said this was not superstition. He said this was the same logic as surgery. The body that is sick must be treated. The dead that are not passing must be helped to pass. I cannot write in this deposition that I approved this course of action officially, because as an imperial surgeon operating under Habsburg Commission, I had no legal authority to approve it, and it was not within my medical mandate. What I can write is that I did not prevent it, and that on the afternoon of the 16th, while I returned to the garrison office to organize my notes, the village council and Father Dusan conducted their treatments of 3 of the 4 graves I had examined, and Schreiber looked the other way, and I was in the office writing field notes that did not mention what was happening 50 meters away in the churchyard, and I was aware of the smell, faint, from the direction of the churchyard, a different character now, layered over the copper-sweet smell, with something burned and something resinous from the torches. It took 3 hours. By the time it was finished, the smell from the churchyard had changed, and by the following morning it was gone. I know how to read that sentence. I am writing it in this deposition as a factual observation, not as a supernatural claim. The smell changed after the village procedures. I recorded the change. I cannot explain it within my training. On the 17th, the garrison split. The event that triggered it was Brenner. He had spent the night in the storeroom as he had been doing, in a chair with a lantern. At some point before first light, Schreiber's orderly, going to the storeroom for morning supplies, found the storeroom empty. The lantern was on the floor, still lit. Brenner's coat was on the chair. His boots were on the floor beside it. The storeroom door opened to an exterior lane, and the door was open. The orderly reported this to Schreiber, and Schreiber reported it to me, and within 30 minutes half of the garrison knew. The men who had maintained that Brenner was suffering from grief-induced disturbance said he had simply walked out, that grief and sleeplessness had destabilized him, and that he would be found somewhere in the village or on the road. The men who had believed his account said that Hoff had come back for him, and that Brenner had gone willingly, and that the rest of them needed to evacuate the garrison before they were visited in turn. The second group was wrong about the mechanics, I believe. But they were not wrong that the situation had passed into territory Schreiber's command authority was not designed to manage. Schreiber asked me directly, should we search for Brenner or should we concentrate on securing the garrison? He asked it as a command question, the way officers ask questions when they already see the answer but need confirmation from someone with authority over a different domain. I told him we should search for Brenner. He agreed. He organized a search in 2 groups, one through the village and one toward the road. I joined the village search. Metzger came with me. We found Brenner at dawn, near the churchyard wall, seated on the ground with his back against the stone. Not unconscious, not feverish, but silent in a way that required several minutes of effort to break. He was in his shirt sleeves in January cold. He was not shivering. He was not appearing to feel the cold. When he finally looked at me and registered my presence, he told me that Tobias had come for him in the storeroom in the night, and that he had gone out to him, and that they had sat by the churchyard wall for some time, and that Tobias had said he was not angry, and that Brenner was to tell his mother in Styria that there was nothing to be afraid of. Then Tobias had gone back through the gate, and Brenner had stayed where he was because he had not known what else to do. Brenner was not delirious. He was not feverish. His pupils were equal and responsive. He was cold and exhausted, and absolutely clear in his account. I wrapped him in my own coat and had Metzger walk him back to the garrison. Then I stood at the churchyard wall alone for a moment in the early light. The smell was there, very faint at the gate. The copper-sweet warmth of it, cold morning air around it, the smell itself distinctly warm, as though coming from a body temperature source, rather than the frozen stone. I stood still and breathed it. It lasted perhaps a minute. Then the cold took it. I returned to the garrison. The split in the men did not resolve. Over the next 2 days, the 17th and 18th, Schreiber lost effective command authority in the quiet way that happens not through mutiny, but through the gradual withdrawal of cooperation. Men followed orders, technically, but they slept in groups, stopped taking individual assignments near the churchyard, stopped leaving the garrison building after dark alone. 3 men had formally requested transfer to another posting in writing, which was within their rights under the military code. 2 others had informally approached Schreiber and asked him to request a full unit relocation, which was not within Schreiber's discretion to grant without orders from Parakin. I wrote to Parakin on the evening of the 17th. I wrote 2 letters. The first was the formal communication. drafted in the careful language of a man who is constructing a report around what can be admitted. I described the villagers' concerns, the exhumations, the anomalous preservation findings, and the garrison's morale difficulties, and I recommended a medical assessment of the village water supply and a replacement of the garrison cohort as a precautionary mental health measure. I mentioned nothing of my own smell observations. I mentioned nothing of Brenner's encounter. I described the village procedures as folk remedies, conducted without imperial endorsement. The second letter I wrote to no one in particular, that is to say, to myself. I wrote it in my field journal, late, by lantern, while the garrison slept badly around me, and I wrote it in the form of questions, because those were all I had. Why does smell correlate so precisely with proximity to the phenomenon, and not to the graves themselves? Why is the preservation so anomalous and so specific to these 14 individuals, and not to any of the other dead in the churchyard? Why does the pattern of appearance follow relationship history rather than geographic proximity? Why did the smell come to the garrison office, to my rooms, 40 meters from the nearest grave, on the afternoon of the 15th? I had no answers. I wrote the questions, and then I blew out the lantern and lay in the cold dark and listened to the village. There were no sounds from the churchyard. On the morning of the 18th, one of the village councilmen came to the garrison to report that Marta Vukovic was asking to speak with me again. I went with Metzger to her house in the eastern end of the village, a solid low building with blackthorn bunched at every window and a line of something dried and dark, garlic soaked in salt, and something else I did not recognize, nailed across the top of the doorframe. Inside it was warm and close. The smell of her house a thick domestic weave of dried herbs, old wood, animal fat, and underneath everything the faint mineral sweetness that I was by now beginning to recognize as ambient in the village itself, as though the soil of the place had absorbed something that it was slowly releasing through the cold air. Marta had something to tell me. She said, through Metzger, that 11 of the 14 names on the list had now been addressed, meaning that the village procedures had been applied to 11 of the graves, and that the sightings associated with those 11 had, in each case, ceased. She named the 11. I checked them against my commission paper. They matched. She said 3 remained, and that those 3 were the ones the village council was most concerned about, because 2 of them were recent and one was a man who had died with what she called a particular kind of anger, not ordinary grief or unfinished business, but a fury at something specific that she would not name directly, and that kind of anger, in her account, made them harder to settle. I asked her, harder in what way? She said, more willing to push, more willing to come into spaces they should not come into, more willing to forget what they had been and become only what they wanted. I wrote this down. I asked her which of the 3 she considered most urgent. She named the one she would not tell me the reason for. A man called Bogdan Krinik died in late November of something she described obliquely as an injury sustained in a quarrel, buried 7 weeks ago. She said he had been seen 4 times, by 4 separate witnesses, at 2 different locations, and that one of those locations was not his own neighborhood, but the eastern end of the village, near households he had had no connection to in life. I noted that departure from the pattern. Until now, every sighting had followed the logic of prior relationship. If Kroenig was appearing in unfamiliar territory, he had either expanded his range, or he was following a connection I had not yet identified. I asked Marta whether she knew of any connection between Kroenig and anyone in the eastern end. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said there was a debt, not money, a different kind. She would not be more specific. She said the council needed to attend to his grave today, that it had been delayed because of a dispute within the council about the proper method for a case of this severity, and that she wanted me to understand what might happen if they did not act quickly. I asked her what might happen. She said, he will come inside. I took that to mean, into the houses of those he had unfinished business with. It did not occur to me then that she might mean something more literal. I was wrong not to consider it. I returned to the garrison at midday and found Schreiber in the yard in conversation with 3 of his soldiers. one of whom was the Corporal Metzger, who had come back ahead of me and was describing our meeting with Marta in some detail. Schreiber saw me coming and dismissed the soldiers and walked toward me with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely comfortable with. He said the men who had asked for transfer were going to leave in the morning, that he had decided not to contest it under the circumstances, and that he had also decided to concentrate the remaining garrison in the main building through the night, no exterior postings after dark. He said this as a man stating a practical decision, not as a man admitting defeat, and I understood both the distinction and its fragility. I told him what Marta had said about Krnik. He asked me what I thought it meant. I told him I thought the village council needed to be allowed to proceed with the remaining 3 graves as a matter of urgency, and that as imperial investigator I was not going to prevent them, and was recommending that he not prevent them either. He said, "And what do you put in your report?" I said, "I am still determining that." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he would pass the word to Father Dusan that the garrison would not interfere. We spent the afternoon of the 18th in a kind of suspended preparation, the village council organizing itself for the evening procedures, Schreiber pulling his men inside, me sitting in the garrison office working on my field notes, and trying to decide what I was willing to write officially, and what I was willing to keep only for myself. I had been in Medvedja for 6 days. I had 4 exhumations with anomalous findings, 3 of them now treated by village procedure. I had Brenner's account, and my own twice-documented smell observation. I had Marta's testimony, and Father Dusan's. I had a garrison in the early stages of organizational collapse. And I had a list of 14 names on imperial commission paper, 11 of which were now resolved by village procedure, 3 of which were not yet addressed, one of which, Krnik, Marta had described with a kind of urgency that I was, by the evening of the 18th, taking seriously in a way I would not have been capable of on the morning of the 12th. I was also aware, sitting in that office in the late afternoon cold, that I had not yet determined what the smell meant. I had documented it. I had confirmed it across multiple independent sources. I had noted its escalating presence and its directional characteristics, strongest at the graves, detectable at the churchyard perimeter, present briefly in the garrison office, always warmer than the surrounding air, always with that copper-sweet mineral character that I had no existing category for in my training. It was not animal decomposition. It was not plant decomposition. It was not a known chemical compound from any process I had studied. It was, in every technical sense, an anomalous odor of unknown origin that correlated with a phenomenon I could not explain. I wrote that in my field journal, and then I read it back to myself, and then I sat for a while. Around 5 in the evening, as the light was failing, I heard the sound of movement from the churchyard direction, Father Dusan and the village council beginning their preparations. Then, perhaps 20 minutes later, at the window of the garrison office, I noticed the smell, not faint, not the ambient trace I had been experiencing since arrival, full and present, right there at the window, as though someone were standing just outside the shuttered glass, warm and copper-sweet, the metallic turned earth layer underneath, the whole distinctive signature of it, pressing through the cracks in the shutter. I sat completely still. I noted the time by my pocket watch, 5:15 in the afternoon. The smell did not diminish. It persisted, and as it persisted, it intensified, not sharply, but steadily, the way smoke builds in a room when a fire is poorly drawing. I stood up and went to the office door, opened it into the corridor, and checked whether I could smell it there. I could not. The corridor was cold and clean-smelling, boot wax and stone. The smell was specific to the window side of the office. I returned to my desk. I want to note for this board that at no point during what followed did I experience anything I would classify as fear in the clinical sense. I experienced something more like the total concentration of attention that occurs in surgical emergency, a narrowing of all processing to the immediate facts. I note this not to present myself favorably, but because it is relevant to my reliability as a witness. I sat at the desk and waited. The smell continued. After perhaps 10 minutes at that sustained intensity, it began to do something I had not experienced in the previous encounters. It shifted character, not weaker, differently weighted. The copper component became more prominent, the earth's sweetness receded, and what rose in its place was something warmer, closer to body heat than to soil, the smell of a warm hand rather than warm earth, as though whatever was producing it had changed its distance or its position. Then it stopped, completely, all at once, not fading, gone. I opened the shutter. The lane outside was empty, no one in view in either direction. The cold was sharp and clean and completely without that smell. The churchyard wall was visible 40 meters to the right, and from the direction of the churchyard I could hear the low voices of Father Dusan and the council, still at their work, and see the orange flicker of their torches through the gaps in the wall. Nothing moved in the lane. I stood at the open window in the cold for a long time. Then I closed the shutter and wrote in my field journal. Third documented instance. Garrison office, window proximity, 5:15 to 5:28 in the afternoon, 18th January. Duration approximately 13 minutes. Character, present, sustained, escalating, then absent. No source located. This entry was written as the last full entry I made in Medvedja before the events of the night of the 18th and the morning of the 19th. I must now describe what happened that night, and I want this board to understand that this portion of the account is the one for which I have no medical or scientific explanation and have had none in the 8 years since the events occurred. I have had 8 years. I have returned to the notes. I have consulted colleagues I trust with qualified versions of the account. I have found no framework that contains it honestly, without distortion. What I am about to give you is what happened. Father Dusan completed the village procedures on 2 of the 3 remaining graves, those of 2 individuals whose names appear on my list, by approximately 7 in the evening. The 3rd grave, Krönik's, remained unaddressed. The reason for this, as Schreiber reported to me afterward, was that a dispute had arisen within the council about the method, one faction insisting on the standard procedure and another, led by 2 older men, whose relationship to Krönik in life I was not fully briefed on, insisting on an additional element involving the placement of certain materials in the grave before treatment. The argument extended into the evening. Father Dusan waited. The 2 completed graves were treated by torch and procedure. Krönik's grave sat opened in the dark. Schreiber had pulled his men inside and posted 2 at the garrison building's interior entrance, standard protocol for a secured position. The rest of the garrison was in the 2 sleeping rooms and the main corridor. I was in the office. Metzger was in the corridor. Brenner had been allowed back into the main sleeping room that evening, after I assessed him as stable and clear-minded, and several of his bunkmates had specifically requested his return, which I noted as a sign of unit cohesion reasserting itself. At approximately 11 at night, the smell came into the garrison building. Not through the window this time. From the direction of the main corridor. I became aware of it gradually, the way one becomes aware of a change in temperature, by the accumulation of small signals below the threshold of active attention until it breaks through. I had been reading by lantern, and then I was sitting still, and then I realized why. I stood and went to the office door and opened it. The corridor was dark. The lantern at the far end was still lit. The 2 soldiers at the interior entrance were visible at the far end of the corridor. One of them turned toward me with a candle raised, the other facing the entrance door. The smell was stronger in the corridor than in the office. Warmer, fuller. The copper-sweet earth combination, but with that body warmth register I had first noticed at the window earlier in the afternoon. I walked down the corridor toward the soldiers at the entrance. As I walked, I noted that the smell grew stronger the closer I came to the entrance door. One of the soldiers, a young private whose name I did not know then and do not know now, said to me in a low voice that something smelled wrong, that it had started maybe 5 minutes ago and had been getting stronger. I asked him whether anything had approached the door. He said not that he had seen, and that he had been watching. The entrance door was heavy, double-planked, and barred from the inside with a timber crossbar. I examined the bar. It was in place. I put my hand against the door. The door was cold, as expected. Cold stone building. January night. But the crack at the threshold, the gap between the base of the door and the stone floor, showed a thin line of warmer air. I knelt and put my hand near it. The warm smell came through that gap. The copper sweet of it was concentrated there, like water from a slow spring. I stood up. Then, from somewhere in the sleeping rooms, there was a sound. Not a scream, not a crash. A sound harder to describe than either of those. A collective intake of breath. The sound of several men registering something simultaneously. Then one voice, not shouting. More the voice of a man carefully not shouting. "Get the lantern. Get the lantern now." I went toward the sleeping rooms. Metzger was ahead of me, moving fast. By the time I reached the doorway of the first sleeping room, a lantern had been raised, and every man in that room was awake and on his feet and looking at the same thing. The window of the sleeping room was open. Not broken, not forced. Open. A winter window in a garrison barracks, latched from the inside, now open, the cold air moving the paper tacked to the inside frame, the lantern light pressing against the darkness of the opening. No one had opened it. No one claimed to have opened it. Brenner was standing at the far end of the room from the window, pressed against the wall, not with the expression of a frightened man, but with the expression of a man looking at something he recognizes. I crossed the room to the window and looked out. The lane outside was empty. 40 meters to the right, the churchyard wall. To the left, the village, dark and quiet. Nothing in the lane. No movement in either direction. The cold air came in steadily, and the smell came with it, from outside, from the direction of the churchyard, its character now the strongest I had encountered in any location outside the open graves themselves. Schreiber came into the room behind me. He looked at the window. He looked at me. I could see him deciding how to classify this so that it remained manageable. He said, very quietly, "Krennic's grave is still open." I said, "I know." He said, "We need to close it." I said, "It's past midnight." He said, "I know." We were two men with different kinds of authority, conducting a conversation about whether to go to the churchyard in the middle of the night, when the smell was at its strongest, and a grave was open, and a unit of soldiers was awake and frightened behind us. The pragmatic case for waiting until morning was obvious. The counter-argument, which neither of us made aloud but both understood, was that Father Dusan's urgency about Krennic was not arbitrary, and that Marta's warning about a dead man willing to come inside was something we were looking at the physical evidence for right now, through an open window that had been latched an hour before. I made a decision. I told Schreiber that I was going to the churchyard with whoever would volunteer to come, and that we would close Krennic's grave whether or not the village council had resolved their procedural dispute. Schreiber said he was coming with me. Metzger said he was coming. One other soldier, a man named Georg Falb, who was older than most of the garrison, and who had the manner of someone for whom doing the thing is preferable to waiting to do the thing, said he would come. Brenner started to rise, and I told him to stay where he was, and after a moment he sat back down, and I was glad of it. We took 3 lanterns and went out through the garrison's side entrance into the lane. The cold hit immediately, the sharp, deep cold of January at elevation, the kind that clears the head whether you want it cleared or not. The smell was in the open air around us from the moment we stepped out, ambient now, as though it had seeped into the lane itself, but directional, stronger toward the churchyard, pulling our attention that way, the way water pulls attention downhill. The churchyard was perhaps 40 meters from the garrison side entrance. We moved together. Schreiber and Falb ahead, Metzger beside me, the lanterns making a small constellation in the dark. The village was silent, in the way that villages are silent at midnight in winter. No dogs, no cattle sounds, no wind. The specific silence of a settlement that has gone inside and closed its doors. The kind of silence that has a shape to it. At the churchyard gate, Falb stopped and held up his lantern. The gate was standing open. It had been closed and latched when Father Dusan and the council had finished their work and departed. It was open now, not broken. Open, as though someone had lifted the latch from the inside. We stood at the gate and looked in. The churchyard was dark beyond the reach of our lanterns, the shapes of markers and the humped ground of graves visible at the perimeter of the light, the deeper portions of the yard lost in darkness. The 2 treated graves were visible near the wall, the earth of them closed and settled. Krynik's grave was 30 meters in, toward the older section, and I could not see it from the gate. Schreiber said, without drama, "We go in." We went in. I will describe the walk across the churchyard as I described the rest, factually and in sequence, because the tendency when describing something of this nature is to use language that makes it feel symbolic or atmospheric. And this board has asked for my sensory record. My sensory record is this. The ground was frozen, and the lantern light made the frost crystals in the grass visible, each one a small, specific spark. The markers cast irregular shadows that moved as we moved. The smell intensified steadily as we crossed the yard, the progression from ambient to directional to concentrated that I had come to associate with proximity to whatever was producing it. By the time we were 20 meters from Krynik's grave, the smell was the strongest it had been at any point in my 6 days in Medvedja, warmer than the air by what felt like several degrees. Dense enough that I noticed my own breathing had slowed, becoming deliberate, as the body sometimes responds to a strong chemical presence. We reached the grave. Krynik's grave was 10 feet long and had been opened that afternoon by Father Dusan and the council in preparation for the procedure. The wooden cover the council had placed over the opening to protect it, while they resolved their dispute, had been moved to one side. The grave was open to the night sky. The coffin below was visible in the lantern light, the lid displaced, lying to one side within the grave cavity. Falb held his lantern over the opening. The coffin was empty. Schreiber looked at me. Metzger looked at Schreiber. Falb held the lantern steady with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that steadiness is what the situation requires. The smell rose from the open grave in a warm column, fully concentrated, fully present. The copper sweet earth warmth of it, the most physically immediate sensation I was experiencing in that moment, more present than the cold, more present than the lantern light. I knelt at the edge of the grave and examined the coffin with my lantern held low. The shroud was present, gathered and folded, as though it had been carefully removed from a body and set aside, not thrown, not tangled, folded. On the inner surface of the coffin lid, on the wood, there were marks. I examined them closely. Scratches in the wood, vertical, the width consistent with fingernails, deep enough to have required force. They were old, relative to the other evidence in the coffin, consistent with the 14 days of interment, rather than fresh. They were on the inside of the lid. I stood. I looked at the empty grave. I looked at the folded shroud. I looked at the marks. Metzger made a sound that was not a word. Schreiber took one step back from the edge of the grave, and then stopped himself. Falb did not move. I noted all of this as I note everything, automatically, clinically, because that is what 17 years of training produces, the habit of observation when observation is the only tool you have left. Then Falb said, quietly and completely without inflection, "Something is behind you." I do not use the word terror in clinical records. I use it now, in this deposition, as an accurate descriptor. I felt terror in the moment before I turned. The whole body's version of it, simultaneous and total, the cold heat of it, the instruction to move and the inability to move, occupying perhaps 2 full seconds before I turned. Behind me, at the edge of the lantern light, perhaps 15 feet from where I stood, there was a figure. I cannot give this board a complete physical description, and I want to explain why in terms that are themselves part of the testimony. The lantern light reached partially. The figure stood at the margin of the light, partly in the dark, and what the light revealed was a man's height. a man's general form, dressed in what appeared to be linen, the garment you bury men in that village in winter. He was standing. He was upright and still, with the particular stillness of something that is not still because it is resting, but still because it has chosen not to move yet. He was facing us. I could see, in the partial light, that his face was turned toward us, though the detail of the face was lost in the dark beyond the lantern's reach. He did not move. He stood there. We stood there. The smell was everywhere, enveloping, without direction now, without source or vector, because we were inside it. Falb had his lantern raised. Schreiber had not moved. Metzger was to my left and very still. I was facing the figure and I was breathing slowly and carefully, and thinking, clinically, because that is what I do, that the distance between us was 15 feet and decreasing, that the decrease was occurring not through visible movement, but through the quality of what I was seeing, as though the figure were approaching by some means other than walking, becoming more present and more detailed without appearing to take steps. The face, when enough of it came into the lantern light, was the face of a man 7 weeks dead, by my count, by Marta's account, by the burial records. The face of a man 7 weeks dead who did not look 7 weeks dead, who looked, in the reaching lantern light, as he must have looked when he was living, the coloration present, the tissue present, the eyes open and clear and focused on me. The eyes were focused on me, not on Schreiber, not on Falb, not on Metzger, on me. The specific attention of it, the precision of being looked at by something that should not be able to look at anything, was more disturbing than anything else in that moment, and remains so 8 years later. Whatever its unfinished purpose was, it had identified me as the relevant party, the man from Vienna who had come to investigate, the man with the commission paper. I made a decision. It was not a rational decision in the way my training uses that word. It was made in the 2 seconds available to me, under full sensory pressure, and I have had 8 years to assess it, and I believe it was the right decision for the wrong reasons, and I will explain both. I took the commission paper from my coat pocket, the folded sheet with 14 names in my careful surgical hand. I held it out toward the figure, toward the light. I do not know what I intended by this gesture. Some portion of my mind, the bureaucratic portion that Vienna had spent years forming, reached for the nearest available symbol of authority, an imperial document, a record, evidence that I had come in an official capacity, that I had counted the dead, that I had written their names, that I had treated this matter with the seriousness it deserved. It was an absurd gesture. I have spent 8 years not being able to fully describe why I made it, except that it was the only thing I had in my hands. The figure looked at the paper, then it looked at me, then it turned, not away from us, not retreating, but sideways, toward the churchyard wall, the way a person turns when they have been acknowledged, and they no longer need to press the point. It moved toward the wall, in the lantern light, at its edge and then beyond it, and then it was dark, and the smell was still there but stationary, no longer approaching, and the churchyard was quiet and cold, and 4 men were standing at an empty grave with their lanterns and their hearts working hard. Schreiber said, "Close the grave." Falb and Metzger closed the grave with the displaced earth, working fast in the lantern light. Schreiber stood facing the direction the figure had gone, watchful, not frozen. I stood with the commission paper in my hand. I noticed, when I brought it close to my lantern to look at it, that the corner, the edge I had extended toward the figure, was damp, not from my hand, not from the frozen ground, from something else. A staining had begun at that corner, pale, transparent in the lantern light, the color of water with something small dissolved in it, and it was spreading slowly inward, toward the final entry on the list, the final name, Koenig's name. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. We returned to the garrison. Father Dusan came the following morning and completed the treatment of Koenig's grave. The village council's procedural dispute had, by the account Schreiber gave me, resolved itself overnight. Father Dusan did not ask me what had happened in the churchyard. I did not tell him. He performed the procedure, and it was completed by midday, and the smell in the village, which had been present at varying intensities since my arrival, was gone by the following morning. The 19th of January, 7 days after I arrived. Gone from the churchyard, gone from the lane, gone from the garrison office window, gone from the threshold of my own rooms, gone in the way that symptoms resolve after a condition is addressed, not gradually, but completely, as though whatever mechanism had been producing the signal had been switched off. I conducted no further exhumations after the 17th. The remaining 9 names on my list were addressed by Father Dusan and the village council in the days following my departure, and their resolution was communicated to me by letter to Parakin in February, after I had returned. All 9 resolved. No further sightings reported. No further incidents. I spent 2 more days in Medvedja, completing my notes and my official report. The official report I transmitted to Vienna was one I was, and remain, unable to defend as an accurate account. I described anomalous preservation findings attributable to soil composition and cold weather conditions. I described the village's folk remedies as culturally consistent behavior that did not require imperial intervention. I described Brenner's episode as grief-induced somnambulism. I described the garrison's command difficulties as short-term morale strain from extended frontier posting. I described no smells. I described no churchyard visit. I described no figure at the edge of the lantern light. I described no commission paper, no staining, no last name on the list becoming damp at midnight in January in a churchyard in Transylvania. I signed it, and I sent it. I want this board to understand what that cost me. Not the commission, not the pension, though those came later, when a man who had been in Medvedja with me spoke more freely than I had, and Vienna began asking questions about the discrepancies between my field notes and my official report. Those losses were practical. The deeper cost, the one I am describing as part of this deposition because it is relevant to the validity of my testimony, was the cost to what I will call my working assumption. I arrived in Medvedja with a framework that the Enlightenment had given me, a set of tools for sorting the world into categories that held. What I found in Medvedja did not fit any of those categories, and after I left, and after I submitted a report that reflected the categories rather than the findings, I found that the categories had stopped working for me in other contexts as well. Not dramatically. I did not become a superstitious man. I continued to practice surgery for 4 more years before my commission was revoked, and my surgical outcomes in those years were as good as they had ever been. But something in the structure of my professional confidence, the part that allows a surgeon to hold a tool and know what it will do and why, had been altered. I encountered, in subsequent work, things I could not explain, things that before Medvedja I would have explained quickly, and after Medvedja I could not. A patient who recovered from an injury that should have been fatal and described the experience of recovery in terms that made the hair rise on my arms. A soldier who died of a wound too quickly, too cleanly, with an expression on his face that was not the expression of a man dying of a wound. Small things. Things that would not trouble a man who had never seen what I saw in that churchyard. They troubled me. That is the accurate cost, not the pension. The pension I could have found other income for. I could not find other income for the habit of looking at the edges of things and seeing more than was comfortable. I still have the commission paper. It is in my possession, folded as it was folded the night I extended it toward the figure in the lantern light. The staining covers the final entry. Kronik's name, almost completely now. It continued to spread after I returned to Parakin, slowly, over the course of several weeks, until it reached its current extent. I showed it to one colleague in Vienna, a man I trusted, and described its origin. He examined the stain chemically and told me it was organic in nature and consistent with, he believed, a very dilute solution of blood and interstitial fluid. The kind of fluid present in the tissue of a body. I told him where it had come from. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said he would prefer not to know that. I understood. I folded the paper back up and put it away, and I have not taken it out again except to confirm that the staining has not progressed further. It has not progressed further. I have answered this inquest board's questions as honestly as I am able, and I have accounted for all 14 names and for all 3 instances of the smell and for the physical artifact as requested. I do not know what to conclude from what I witnessed in Medvedja in January of 1723. I am a surgeon, not a theologian, and the proper instrument for measuring what I witnessed has not yet been made. What I will say, in closing, is this. The Enlightenment arrived in the capitals of Western Europe in full confidence that it had inherited a mapped world. I was part of that project. I carried its tools to Medvedja in a battered leather case, and I applied them as carefully as I had been trained to apply them, and what I found was not that the tools were wrong. The tools worked. They showed me exactly what was in front of me. What they could not do was make it fit the map. And that, I think, is the discovery that the century I have lived in is not yet equipped to absorb. Not that reason fails in darkness, but that the darkness is larger than the room we have lit so far, and the things that live in the unlit portions are not waiting for our definitions. They were named before we arrived. They will be active after we are done arguing about what to call them. I have no further testimony to offer at this time. The commission paper is available to this board for examination upon request. I would ask that it be returned to me afterward. It is the only proof I have, and I have stopped trying to explain what it proves. Some records exist not to resolve the question, but to mark the place where the question became too large for the answer we thought we had.